Okay, hi. I'll just give you a little bit of background of where I come from. So I graduated and trained as a doctor, and I actually practiced as a doctor. And shortly after practicing, I worked on a leprosy colony. And in the leprosy colony, I was really struck by the way that patients or people that were part of the community were actually using really low-tech devices in order to reconstitute their being. It had nothing to do with anatomy in the end, it was about belonging. And so there were very simple devices like leather straps that would be tied around the big toe and attached to the knee, that would stop feet kind of dragging on the ground and therefore opening up the flesh and getting infected, so then bones would start to be melted by bacteria. And one that really intrigued me was a big pot of wax that everybody used to use when they had a nasal sag. It's called a lion face that people had when they had leprosy, where the leprosy eats the soft palate, so it eats cartilage and it eats the cartilage of your nose, so that all this part of the face falls flat. And so with the big pot of wax, they'd mould themselves a nice pointy nose and stick it up through the big hole in the roof of their mouth, and then give themselves really pointy noses. But they also, it surprised me as a junior doctor then that people took pride in their aesthetics, and that, you know, what kind of glasses that you actually wore over your pointy nose really mattered. Ray-Ban were definitely in. And the other thing that we were doing was doing tendon transfers. So we would take tendons from the fingers and insert them into the thumb so that people could have a functional grip. And we could do that in the middle of nowhere because somebody with a leprous body can't feel, so we don't need an anaesthetist. There's no anaesthetic risk. The other thing we could do is split the temporalis muscle here and insert it, instead of into the jaw, into the eye. So then, not only did you get your dark glasses, but you could also chew gum, so that when you chewed, you would blink your eye. And so these rewirings and reconfigurations and reimagining of the body set me off on this path of thinking about, okay, so I'm a medical doctor, I've learned the Gray's Anatomy, I've spent hours in an anatomy lab trying to normalize and regulate what it means to be human, and all of a sudden I go to a community of people with leprosy and everything's turned on its head. So what the hell does that mean? And so that question actually stayed with me. It's never really gone away, and that really is the framing for where I come from in terms of the things that I did next. So when I came back to the UK, you know, there weren't really the opportunities that I'd had in India to study, I guess, the cultural, social, and I guess aesthetic effects of being alternatively bodied. So I started to work with performance artists like Orlan. And the thing that actually attracted me to Orlan's work was the fact that she'd actually completely and utterly inverted the power structure in the anatomy theatre. So no longer was the surgeon the high priest. It was this fabulous woman, a complete diva, who in a surgical theatre is very, very vulnerable. Very vulnerable. I mean, you know, there's this whole hierarchy of order and a complicity and a trust that you place in the hands of a surgeon. And in some ways, you know, we're kind of glad that happened. But Orlan's radical moves into, you know, the politics of the body through this performance really, really intrigued me. And I was really keen to explore that a bit more. And so I worked with Stellark on a 7-year project, was to develop an extra ear. He came to me one day with the idea that he was going to put an extra ear on the side of his face. And, you know, having read my anatomy books, I said, well, that's right over the facial nerve. You'll end up with a one-sided palsy if you put your ear on your extra ear in your face. So I introduced him to some plastic surgeons, and after a 7-year journey, he eventually had it resited on the underside of his left forearm, and also had a Bluetooth chip inserted there, but that had to be surgically removed. And actually it was quite interesting because both Orlan and Stellark had trouble with implants. There was an awful lot of infection, and I'm not sure whether that was just because cosmetic surgery was really just only starting. We'd only really just had the first generation of local anaesthetics. I mean, the early 90s was when we started to be able to put people comfortably, not quite to sleep, but actually to put them into a state where you could operate and they couldn't feel, but they could remain awake. So before then, you had to have a general anaesthetic, and that really was the technology that started to change the relationship between bodies and intervention. And it does intrigue me now how many body hackers there are that do self-mutilation or self-modification without any anaesthetic, because there's a number of them around. What I wanted to quickly say, and I'm sure there's a time limit on this, was that all these collaborations that I've done, I mean, and Orlan and Stella were just a couple, made me think about the framing of the human body in the 21st century. I'd grown up with the assumption that the body was a machine, so that machine metaphors, lead to ideas about cyborgs, or the idea of a singularity where we're actually becoming a machine, a kind of a super being that, like Stella was exploring, is somehow rather harder and drier and more suited to extraterrestrial existence. Essentially, I decided to reject the idea that the body was actually a machine. And really, it's been a millennial revelation for me. There are about 4 factors that are coming into play. The first is that we're an age of, we've had our first generation digital natives, so that we're used to being connected to everything, that identity quite seamlessly within a single person can be a whole bunch of contradictions. We're a different person at home, a different person on the internet, a different person at work. We may not even be the same person at work in the morning as in the afternoon. That's okay, and nobody, that's not necessarily crazy. The other thing is that over the course of the 20th century, there's been a rise of a very interesting science that has a different ontology to classical scientific discourse, and that is complexity. Complexity looks at networks of interactions, it looks at process, it looks at forms of organisation and systems. So it's a different way of thinking about the way that the world works to, say, an object-oriented hierarchy. The next thing, of course, is our ecological crisis, so that we are now aware that the world in which we are immersed is not static and made up of objects that are organised passively in a form of hierarchy, but actually, it's more of a Heraclitean universe where the whole place is in a continual flux. Whereas machines don't sit within that organisational paradigm very, very comfortably at all, because they operate from a design perspective of equilibrium, whereas our nature is at non-equilibrium. So these paradigms are all converging at the beginning of this millennium and actually changing our framing of reality. And I'm going to suggest that the body is no longer a machine, but it's an ecology. Or, as I've been trying to express, an ecology, instrumented ecologies, because they're not passive. We're actually culturally editing, socially conditioning the assemblages, these heterogeneous groups of agents that are always moving around, always interacting with each other. And unlike cybernetic systems, they're capable of making a radical act of transformation. And so I think that there is a new way of framing the technology, the ordering of the body, that will give us new insights into identity. It will challenge power structures, forms of dichotomies, mind-body splits, nature and the synthetic. And so I think that we are actually. I think these ideas about cyborgs are they're looking at new groupings of things within, I guess, still the old machine paradigm. I'm going to call the machine paradigm an old paradigm. I'm sure I'll get challenged on that, I don't care. But the machine paradigm is an old 20th century idea about the body. We are these very fluid collections of interacting, far from equilibrium material systems that are always reinventing, always forming new relationships. And these are not just physical, they're also cultural and social. And so I think with that framing, we'll start to be able to see new possibilities for self-identification for cultural editing, a great deal more tolerance perhaps that we have of difference than perhaps say that my Grey's Anatomy would have dictated. And I think that if we went on a very long journey to interstellar space and we eventually met again at the other side and we separated on two spaceships and meet at Alpha Centauri, the two spaceship colonies may look incredibly different, but I think there would still be absolutely no contradiction if they were both to call themselves human. So that's what I really want to say.